Okay, thank you, Torrin. I need to get one of those little boards with a little stripy thing and clack down, you know. Anyway, okay, I want to read today from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 6. This is an interesting verse here. By the way, we don't know who the author of this letter to the Hebrews is because he doesn't name himself. In the early church fathers ascribed it to the Apostle Paul, and there's a lot of reasons to think that, but we don't need to get into all those things now. But that's just as plausible as anything. But whoever he is, he's got a lot of insight and very authoritative. And I like this verse 6 that I'm going to read here today. It says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." Now, when I read a verse like this, in verse 6, where it says, without faith it's impossible to please him, that's like saying, if you want to turn it around and say it a little differently, what pleases God is faith. And I think that's what he's saying. The thing that's pleasing to God is our believing and trusting in him. Now, you know, he could have put anything in there. He could have said without blank. You know, he could have put a lot of things in there that I think many Christians assume or have the idea that are the things that please God. You know, he could have put in there without a holy life, it's impossible to please God. Now, I'm not putting that down, but I'm just saying he didn't put that in there. That's not what he said. And the truth of the matter is, if I can be honest, I hope I can be honest on a Sunday morning. If I could just be honest with you, to say holy life, that's all relative. As far as I'm concerned, there's only one person who's holy, and that's Jesus, and everybody else is somewhere short of that. So you could say, I feel like I'm better than that person over there. Maybe there's somebody better than me, and on this sliding scale of righteousness or holiness, you know, I'm somewhere in the middle. But that doesn't really say much. In fact, as a matter of fact, that's not what he says here. But a lot of people think that God's looking for performance, and he's looking at our lives and assessing how well we're doing, how much we read the Bible, or how often we pray. And that's not the case at all. What he says here is without faith it's impossible to please him. That's the thing that he emphasizes. And if you read this entire 11th chapter, that's what he brings out. He brings up all the Old Testament people of renown, like Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Moses. And what he says about them is it's not the things that they did that were important. It's what they believed. It's the fact that they believed what God had said to them. It's the fact that they put their trust in God. And so he's emphasizing that to us. He says, without faith it is impossible to please him. In other words, it's faith. It's our faith that pleases him. Now notice the second part of the verse. He that cometh to God first must believe that he is, or else why would you come to him, I guess. That's kind of a little logical point there. He that cometh to God must believe that he is. And the King James translation says, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And some people get hung up on this word diligent and you know, get off track. Again, it's not about us. This whole thing is not about us and our performance. And this word diligent here is not really part of the, this is written in the Greek language. And this diligently seek him is, those three words are a translation of a single Greek word. And let me give it to you here, just for conversation's sake. This expression, diligently seek him, is exzetio, in the Greek language. And all it means is to seek out, or to search for, or to investigate, or to look into for oneself. That's all. It just means investigate, or look into, or to search for, or to seek for. And many other translations keep that thought and leave out this misleading idea of it's all about my diligence and my, I think a lot of Christians think that it's my earnest and diligent and striving and my moral striving. That's okay, but that's not what God's looking for. Here's what the Phillips translation says: without faith, it is impossible to please Him. The man who approaches God must have faith in two things. First, that God exists, and secondly, that it is worth a man's while to try to find God. Well, I think that's a good way to put it. You're not going to come away empty-handed. It's worth your while to reach out to God. The Message translation, we have this one. Let's put that up. Torrin, could you give me the Message translation on this? I like the Message. It's impossible to please God apart from faith. And why? Because anyone who wants to approach God must believe both that He exists and that He cares enough to respond to those who seek for Him, to seek Him. Isn't that a good thought? A very positive thought. And I think that brings out something really, really good. That, God's not off in heaven indifferent, off doing something else, reading a newspaper, not paying attention. He cares about what's going on in our lives. And what this writer is saying here is what pleases God most, and what the thing is that pleases God is when we look to Him and reach out after Him instead of just, trying to deal with it ourselves. And this includes both our eternal condition and all the other little details of your life. Now, this emphasis on believing or on faith or on trusting is all through the New Testament. And I'd like to read a passage here that I think is a really good one. This is in John's Gospel, chapter 6. And in this 6th chapter of John, and Torrin, I'll tell you which verse here in just a second. Let's see here. Well, I'm just going to start with verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed Him, because they saw His miracles which He did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there He sat with His disciples. And the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up His eyes and saw a great company come unto Him, He saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this He said to prove Him, or to test Him. For He Himself knew what He would do. And Philip answered and said, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them. Now, we don't need to get into the rate of exchange and how much that is. He's just saying we don't have enough money to feed them, and this sum of money that he mentions here, he said even that wouldn't be enough. So what he's saying is we don't have what's necessary, to do what you're asking here, to feed them. And then, even that every one of them might take a little. One of His disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto Him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? So there's this huge multitude. Did it tell how many there were here? I think it's going to in a minute. It says, in verse 10 it says, Jesus said, Make them sit down, and there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, in number about 5,000. So there's 5,000 people gathered. I don't know if you've ever been in a crowd of about that size. That's a significant number of people, gathered in one place. And they've been here evidently a long time, and there's nowhere for them to get food. And so Jesus is saying we're going to feed them. And all they've got, this little boy, it says he has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And he says, what are they among so many? Well, obviously, 5 loaves of bread. I heard one person say, well, they had big loaves in those days. Well, I don't care how big they were. Remember, this little boy is carrying them. So even if you're imagining some truckload-sized bread, this little boy has them. So if this little boy's carrying, whatever he's got in his arms, that's not going to be enough to feed 5,000 people, no matter how you slice it, so to speak. But here's what happened, verse 11. Jesus took the loaves, and when He had given thanks, He distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes, as much as they would. So He took what was there, and He gave thanks, or another of the Gospel says He blessed it. He gave thanks for it, and then he gave it to the disciples, and they started passing it out. And it seems that that little bit of food was enough to feed everyone. Verse 12, and when they were filled, this is interesting to me. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Now this is a miracle that he's done here. He's made this food sufficient to feed this great multitude. And now after they've eaten everything they want, he says, gather up the fragments that nothing be lost. As I was reading over this earlier this week, those words just kind of popped off the page at me, that nothing be lost. You know, you could analyze it and say, well, Jesus just didn't want to be a litter bug. You know, he just didn't want to leave a mess behind. But I don't know. I somehow think there's more to it than that. And you could think in a very broad sense that this reflects God's attitude about people. We're told elsewhere that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to the knowledge of the truth. He doesn't want anybody to be lost. He wants everyone to be in a relationship and to be made right with Him. And that may be a way to look at it. But you know what? The thought that came to my mind today, or the other day when I was reading this, when it said that nothing be lost, I saw this in a way I'd never really considered it before. And this is not in the sense that it's described in the story here, but think about this. I want to make an application to your life. In your life, to get to the point where we are right here today, we're all sitting here today, but we've all come from different points and different backgrounds and different experiences in our lives, and we've all done different things, and we've all made decisions, and sometimes we look back in our lives and we look at things with regret, and we say, well, you know, that decision I made back here, that didn't really pan out, and this thing I did, or this move over here, that didn't, you know, we look back and we think, I would change things. But you know, here's what I want to suggest to you, that your life as a Christian, because you put your faith in Jesus, is blessed. And the attitude of Jesus is that nothing in your life is for no purpose. And things that you might think were mistakes, and things you might think were wrong turns, his attitude is, nothing is lost. Nothing is for no intent. Nothing is for no purpose. And you might not understand how it is, but it goes into your makeup of who you are sitting here today. And Jesus took what that little boy had and he blessed it and made it something that was of use to everyone around him. And I think that's what he does with our lives. And what we have might seem just as insignificant as that boy's lunch, but he's able to bless it and make it valuable to everyone that's around you. Now there's another verse that bears on this, and I'm going to come back here to John 6, but Torrin, could you turn over to Romans chapter 8, verse 28 just for a second? I'd like to read this verse in the light of what I just said. Because you might be thinking about what I just said, that nothing be lost, nothing is for no reason. This verse kind of says the same thing. This is Paul writing, and here's what the King James translation says. In verse 28 of Romans 8, Paul is writing here, and his intent in chapter 8 is to show you the foresight of God and how he has made a good plan for our salvation, for our life, and that we can trust him completely. He says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. Now, I prefer another translation. This is King James, and it was created in 1611 is when the King James translation was made. And I don't know if you've ever looked at you can find these books that have, it's called an interlinear Greek and English New Testament, and it shows you the actual Greek text with a literal word-for-word translation, and the order of the words is all different. Their syntax is different. And so when you put it into English, you have to decide, where does the verb go? Where does the subject go? You have to rearrange it to make it make sense. And there's different options sometimes. Take a verse like this. The great reformer, Martin Luther, 100 years before the King James translation was made, was studying this book of Romans. And he came to this verse, and he was translating it into German. It had never been translated into German before, and he made the first German translation. And when he came to this verse, here's the way he said it. Now see if you can detect what the difference is. And I like the way Luther did this. He says, we know that in all things God works with us for good. Instead of saying the things work, he said God works. What he's saying is, no matter what happens, in everything that happens, we know God is with us working for good. That's the intent. And I think that gets the thought across, because all kinds of things happen in your life. And don't get the idea that God's up in heaven like a puppet master orchestrating everything that happens. You make decisions. You make choices. We all know that's true. I don't have to, spend a lot of time proving that. It's easy to understand that we make the decisions in our lives. But the good news about it is that we just read here what Jesus said when he had them gather up the fragments that nothing be lost. Even though we're making decisions in our lives, God is with us, working with us to make all things for good. No matter what path we choose, no matter where we've gone and what we've done, God's there with us, and he doesn't intend for anything to be lost, and he can make something good out of it. And that's the thought. So that's all bonus material. That's all extra, so I'm not going to charge you for that today. So let's go back to John chapter 6. I just wanted to bring you that to encourage you. And the real reason is because those words just really jumped off the page at me, and that little thought came out. So I thought I should give it to you. That might be valuable for somebody. Okay, now, Torrin, I'm going back to John chapter 6. And Jesus has fed this big multitude, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to just tell you the story. So he was going to send them away, and he went up to pray, and he sent the disciples across this little lake, this little water, and they sailed across to the other side, and this is where they see Jesus walking on the water, and then they get all of them over to the other side, and here come the people again. They've walked all the way around this lake, and they're coming after Jesus again, and it seems as though what they want is just another meal, which is kind of funny. And here come all these people, and verse 25 is where I'm going to take up the story. When they had found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Jesus answered them in verse 26, and he said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. In other words, he's calling into question their motivation. He says, you're not really seeking me because you saw God doing something miraculous. You just want another meal. So he's kind of calling them out on that. And then he corrects them a little bit in verse 27. He says, labor not for the meat which perisheth. In other words, for temporal things. That's not where your primary attention should be. Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. For him hath God the Father sealed. Now he's making two contrasts in this verse, in verse 27. First of all, he says, labor not for the meat which perisheth. Labor is work or exertion of energy. And the meat which perisheth means transitory, temporal things. By contrast, he says there's something more important, and it's eternal life. And notice he doesn't say to labor for it. He says, which the Son of Man shall give you. It's not something you work for. He says, I'm going to just give it to you. So you don't think it's about you investing all of your strenuous energy for this. He's making a contrast here. Don't exert your energy and get your attention on something temporal that's transitory, but I've got something eternal to give to you. Look at verse 28. People ask him a question. Then said they unto him, what shall we do? What shall we do? What shall we do that we might work the works of God? Torrin, could you give me the Amplified translation? I think this makes the question even more pointed. Then they said, what are we to do that we may habitually be working the works of God? And then in the brackets it says, what are we to do to carry out what God requires? And by the way, I remember the first time I ever read this verse, and in my mind, I didn't know then what I the things I know now. And I was really concerned, I was really worried. I was afraid, when I first became a Christian, I felt pretty good for about 10 or 15 minutes until I had time to do something wrong. And then I felt, and the more time went by, I felt like I'm getting off track here. And my conception of the Christian life was like, well, he gives you a second chance, and now you're walking on a tightrope, so to speak, and one false step and you're a goner. That's kind of how I thought of it. I didn't get the big picture that I had entered into something that was so big and so secure. God didn't just take me and put me on a tightrope and say, see how you can perform, and how good you can perform is going to be probably no better than how you performed before, for a while anyway. And I was really concerned about it, and I used to pray that way, because I was really worried about it. I didn't feel very secure. I felt like I felt like I'd been led into an exclusive club, and and I might get expelled or kicked out, for bad behavior. I didn't know what the truth was yet. I had to kind of sort it out for myself. But anyway, I used to pray that way. God, what do you want me to do? I thought that's what it's all about. He wants you to do something, so you got to carry out, some task. And I don't know what I thought in my mind. He'd have some really hard thing for me to do, like go somewhere far away and be a missionary or something, and sit in the dirt and eat worms or something. Something terrible I didn't want to do. See what a terrible conception we have of God, that He's out to torment people and put them into situations where they're least able to fit. The truth of it is just the opposite. His plan is to fit you into a life that fits you like a glove, because He knows who we are inside and out. But anyway, I used to pray this way, and when I first found this verse, I remember stopping and thinking, what they're asking here, that's what I want to know too. What do you require? What are you looking for? What do you want from me? So I read this with great interest. And I'm going back to the King James translation now for the next verse. So I really had my antenna up to see what Jesus would answer. Verse 29. And Jesus answered and said unto them, this is the work of God. Are you ready? That you believe on Him whom He hath sent. Wait, now what? Believe on Him? That's it? Well, you know what? There's a period there and at the end of this sentence, and if there was more to it, I think He should have said so, don't you? I mean, if there was more to it and He didn't say so, He's misleading His hearers. But there's not more to it, because the whole of the Christian life, where we are concerned, is just about one thing. It's putting our faith, placing our confidence, our trust, and our reliance on Jesus. And that's all. We don't have to prove anything. We don't have to demonstrate anything. We don't have to perform in any certain way. That's why the writer to the Hebrews said, without faith, it's impossible to please Him. And here Jesus is saying the exact same thing. This is the work of God, that you believe on Him whom He hath sent. Let's see. I looked this up in a couple of other translations for you. Here's what the Common English Bible says. Here's what God requires, that you believe in Him whom God has sent. That's about the same thing. Here's what the Phillips translation says. The work of God for you, replied Jesus, is to believe on the one He has sent to you. That's the work. You believe on, in other words, put your faith in Jesus. The New Living Translation says, this is the only work God wants from you. Believe in the one whom He has sent. Now, it's not that we don't do other things in our lives. We go on with our lives, but we go on in a new relationship, a relationship of faith and confidence and trust in Him. And then He's able to work. The Amplified, oh, we got that one. Torrin, put the Amplified up here. Let's take a look at that. I really like this because I think this really lays it out. Jesus replied, this is the work, the service that God asks of you, that you believe in the one whom He has sent, that you cleave to, trust, rely on, and have faith in His messenger. That is to say, Jesus. I like those words, cleave to, trust, rely on, have faith in His messenger. That's a pretty good thought, isn't it? Now, we started out, and I think that makes it really plain. But you might still be sitting and thinking, well, that's a little bit vague. How do I put that into practice in my life? Well, let's go back to Hebrews, and I started with chapter 11, verse 6, and Torrin, now I'm going to start with verse 1. And I think if we read up to where we started, this will give us some insight. Hebrews chapter 11 in verse 1. Here's what this writer says to explain what faith is. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. He says that because we're dealing with God and we don't see God. We don't perceive Him with our physical senses. So he's saying faith is our confidence. It gives substance to the things we hope for. It's our evidence of things we don't see. Verse 2 says, "For by it the elders obtained a good report." That is to say, the people that you read about in the Old Testament, that's what made them pleasing in the sight of God, is because they believed Him. Verse 3, "Through faith we understand that the worlds were formed, or framed, by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which do appear." It's faith because we weren't there. We didn't see those things happen. But by faith we believe that that's the way God established things, because we didn't see it. Verse 4, "By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. And by it he, being dead, yet speaketh." If you go back and read about Cain and Abel, they brought sacrifice to God, and Cain offered to God the works of his own hands, what he had worked for. He had the fruit of the earth that he had sweated and labored and worked for. He brought to God the fruit of his own work. Abel, on the other hand, took a lamb from the flock and sacrificed it. And somehow Abel had an instinct that nothing I can do is enough, but there has to be bloodshed for me. There has to be a sacrifice. And this is, of course, a prophetic foreshadowing of Christ. And maybe he had some revelation that there's got to be something more than what I can do. But at any rate, here's what I want to come to. Verse 5. "By faith Enoch was translated, that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. But before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God." And then we come to the verse that we started with, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that seek for him, diligently seek for him." So the verse that we read was actually amplifying or talking about what he just said about Enoch. And let's go back to verse 5 and read that one more time. Torrin. "By faith Enoch was translated, that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony," or this is what was said of him. He pleased God. Now, what I find remarkable about this is, if you go back to the Old Testament and actually read about Enoch, there's almost nothing there. You might think to yourself, well, here's this man who, his whole reputation was that he pleased God. Well, what great and mighty things must he have done, you know? Did he build a big cathedral, you know, or did he go out and convert the world, or, you know, what did he do for God that got this reputation that he pleased God? Well, let's just go back. It's really easy. We could read everything the Bible's got to say about Enoch in just a couple of verses. Torrin, this is Genesis chapter 5, verse 22. Let's just read what we read about Enoch. Genesis chapter 5, verse 22. "And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and begat sons and daughters." Okay? All the days of Enoch were 365 years. Okay? "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." Now, I don't know about you in those three verses, and that's really all we're told about Enoch. We're told about his offspring, told about how long he lived, and the only thing it says that he did was he walked with God. That's all. And he said it twice. Did you notice that? It mentioned it 2 times. Nothing else. It just said that he walked with God. That's all. That's all it said about him. When I was in Bible school, this man came to speak to us. His name was Lester Summerall. And you may have never heard of him. He was a little scrawny man, but he had a big booming voice. And he was a minister in South Bend, Indiana. And he was talking about this verse one time, and he told a little story, what he imagined it was like. And I liked it so well, I kind of borrowed his story. So this came from him, what I'm about to say. And here's the way he imagined, and I think it's a good way to imagine it. So let's just imagine that we're back in the days of Enoch. Those people, did you notice how long he lived? If you read about those first human beings in Genesis, they give their lifespan as hundreds of years. In fact, the very first man, Adam, we're told that he lived 938 years. Or maybe it's 960. Anyway, it's more than 900 years. And so if you add up the dates of when people were born and when they died, Adam was still alive during the lifetime of this man, Enoch. And so if you were, put yourself in Enoch's place, if you were Enoch, wouldn't you want to hear what this first man, Adam, would have to say? And if you go back to Genesis, it says that God came down in the cool of the day and walked with him. So that, maybe Adam, I can just picture Adam, old Grandpa Adam, all of the offspring are gathered around and they say, tell us, Adam, tell us that story again about the garden and how everybody walked with God, how you guys walked with God back there. Oh yeah, Adam says, yeah, we walked with God in the garden, but you can't walk with him anymore. And I can imagine Enoch sitting there listening to that saying, well, maybe you messed it up, maybe you can't walk with him, but if there's a God and he can be walked with, I'm going to walk with him. And so he just believed that he could. Now, you know what? Enoch couldn't see God any more than you can. He was invisible to Enoch just like he's invisible to you. You don't sense him with your physical senses, neither did Enoch. But Enoch evidently decided he could walk with God. That's what it says about him here. He walked with God. So just imagine what that would be like. I just imagine the Enoch, when he went out to plow his field one day, said, God, I heard that Adam walked with you. Well, I guess I'm going to walk with you. Probably didn't feel anything, didn't feel any goosebumps, but he just said, I'm going to walk with you today. And so maybe he came out the next day and prayed that same prayer. God, I'm going to walk with you today. And maybe he just got in the habit of that. And after a while praying that way, maybe he began to sort of have a sense of God being with him, because that's what he believed. He believed that. And we read that God is a rewarder of those that diligently seek. Didn't we read that? That he's a rewarder of those who seek for him. In other words, you don't come away empty-handed. And that's the thing that evidently Enoch was seeking for. And so God came and walked with him. I suppose, because it says he walked with God. And here's what I imagine. The other thing we read about Enoch is that God translated him. That means he took him out of this life into the other world he bypassed death. He didn't go through death. So the way I imagine maybe it happened was, Enoch probably had his daily, I'm going to walk with you today, and he probably began to be aware that God was walking. At least he believed that. And I imagine, this probably went on for a long time, maybe. Who knows? And I can also imagine people started talking about Enoch, saying, that Enoch, he's getting strange. He's out there talking. Nobody's there. But that's okay. I'm sure he didn't care. And so I can imagine one day as he's walking along there in the field, talking to God, because he's walking with him after all, God said to him, you know what, Enoch, you've been coming out here walking with me all these years, day after day. And right now, we're closer to my house than your house. So why don't you just come on home with me now? And Enoch said, okay, believe I will. And he was gone. How about that? I mean, that's what the Bible says. He was not, for God took him. And the only thing we read about is that he walked with God. So as an illustration of what it means to have faith in God in your everyday life, I think that's a good illustration. Because, maybe we don't have the same occupation that Enoch did, but you can walk with God in your life. He'll walk with you in whatever you've got to do. I got one more passage I want to read today, and on the surface you might not immediately see how it applies, but then you will. It's in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, and I think this brings a little more practicality to it. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus is speaking in the King James translation. It says, Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You remember those people in John 6, he said, labor not for the meat which perishes. Jesus is all about setting down your... Don't think that this Christian life is about work, in other words. All he says is, come to me. All ye that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Verse 29 says, take my yoke upon you. A yoke is something that you hook two animals together with. In other words, it's a symbol of union or joining. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Listen to this. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Verse 30, a remarkable verse that I like a lot. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now we just saw that the yoke is a symbol of our union with him. He says, come to me, learn of me. The yoke symbolizes that relationship. And what he says is, my yoke is easy. And what I take from this is, he intends for the Christian life to be easy. I've had conversations with people all different times. You know, some people want to argue with me about some things I say, and that's what and one person said, you're just trying to make it easy for people. Yeah, right. I am. I really am. That is what I'm all about. I want to make it easy. I want to make it practical. And I got the idea right from this verse here. It is supposed to be easy. Either that or Jesus is misleading us. He says, my yoke is easy. Let me just double check. Did he really say that? Okay, E-A-S-Y. Easy. It's not me saying it's easy. It's him saying it's easy. What I say is, if you think it's hard, maybe you're yoked up to something other than Jesus. Because he didn't say get hooked up to a denomination or a system of morality or anything, or a church structure, certainly not a minister, yoked up to him. And he said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Light, easy and light. Now, back up to verse 28 again. Here's why I read this in the context of Enoch walking with God. Torrin, I want to read this from the Message translation, if you would. I like this because it sounds like a TV commercial. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? I could just see Jesus saying that. And that's such a good thought, too, because you can get tired and worn out.